These are the ZYoptics Mitakon Speedmaster lenses for Micro Four Thirds. They are super fast T1.0 Cinema Lenses and really puts that Speedmaster name to the test because man can these lenses gather a lot of speed. I mean, wait, these light. They gather a lot of light. T1.0 is really fast. This is gonna be 3 full stops or like 6 times brighter, 6 times more background blur from your average 2.8 lens, and it's even double the background blur of f1.4, for example. As you can see, these lenses are also cinema lenses, which means gears, smooth aperture ring, and you cannot use these for photography. Well, you can, but I don't know. I always feel kind of silly using something that looks like this to take photos, but it technically is possible, and there really isn't any reason you couldn't take photos with them. I mean, most or all of these are just rehoused photography lenses from the same company. Nothing wrong with that, but that could mean breathing and some other stuff we're gonna look at later might be better or worse than your average cinema lens or photo lens or somewhere in between. I've been using these on weddings, music videos, short and feature films for well over a year at this point, so I feel like I've got a pretty good idea of the strengths and weaknesses of these lenses, and honestly, I don't know if anyone has reviewed all 4 lenses in one video before. These lenses are not perfect by any means, but they've got some real strengths and benefits for filmmakers, videographers, and they, I guess, literally could take a photo if you're insane. So there's that. This set consists of a 17, 25, 35, and 50 millimeters, but these are going to be used mostly on, obviously, Micro Four Thirds cameras and sensors, so their effective field of view is closer to like a 35, 50, 70, and 100 millimeter, more or less. So yeah, this is a pretty great overall range, but if we're talking about the entire scope of videography and film, occasionally 100 millimeters might not be long enough with the 50, and 35 millimeter equivalent isn't exactly a super wide angle. And for a price of $13.39, they are insanely affordable. And just because I should probably clarify, that isn't $1,300 per lens, that is $1,300 for all 4. You can buy them individually for $3.99 each, but you'll get a cool case and a little bit better value buying them in a 3 or 4 lens kit. And while I did buy these lenses on my own, and this is an independent review, I did make an affiliate link for you guys, so if you're considering buying these lenses or anything from ZYoptics, if you would use my link down below, it doesn't cost you anything extra, and it helps out this channel a bunch, and lets me continue to make videos on this stuff. So yeah, just click the link down in the description and that would be super, super great. So of course, a large element of a Cine lens is the build quality, handling, and physical features. And there is a lot of good things to report and a few potential questions I have with this set. So of course, they all do have gears for focus and aperture, and all those gears are in the same place, making switching in and out of rigs relatively easy, although the weight isn't exactly the same between the lenses. It's close enough for most of them. The original 3 lenses, the 17, 25, and 35, have measurements in feet, and they're mirrored on both sides of the lens in case you have a focus puller or some kind of camera assistant, which can definitely be helpful. Although the 50 millimeter is a little bit different. It has focus in feet and meters, which is cool, interesting, but there's no mirrored markings on the other side of the lens because I think it might just have a little bit too long of a focus throw. Something to note. A few more minor things that don't line up exactly between lenses is like the aperture throw and the focus throw just are a little bit different on each lens. For example, the focus throw on the 17 millimeter is 176 degrees, the 25 is 151 degrees, and the 35 is 161 degrees. So all in the ballpark, but definitely notably different. Hasn't really bothered me, but it might make you just think just a little bit harder when you're switching in and out of rigs or calibrating focus. I think it's probably also important to note that that is just a little bit shorter of a focus throw than you would like on some cinema lenses, but for someone that's going to use them as a hybrid, like sometimes video solo and sometimes on a film set, it's a good middle ground in that like 150 to 180 degree range, which I prefer, but Again, if you're using these as dedicated cinema lenses, that focus throw might be a little bit longer than you're expecting. Aperture throw too is like between 60 and 80 degrees, and of course, smooth and clickless like you would expect on a cinema lens. The lenses have 9 aperture blades except for the 17mm, which is down to 8, but it's not really a big deal because it's a little bit wider, and I never noticed it until I looked it up. The filter thread on all the lenses is a handy and standard 77mm, and they all come with a relatively inexpensive feeling, but still kind of cool custom lens cap. Oh, and last thing, the rear element on the 25mm does protrude quite a bit from the mount, which isn't gonna affect your camera or anything, but it does mean you're gonna need that like extra deep lens cap that you find occasionally with micro four thirds lenses. So if you're just switching lenses willy-nilly, you might get one of the shallow ones and not be able to really fit it on the back of the 25mm. A little bit annoying, but not a really big deal. Overall, the build quality is very decent and solid, and handling on a bigger camera like the GH5 or GH6 feels really good, really balanced, either just with the straight camera body or rigged up with a V-mount and some accessories like I like to do occasionally. I think they're pretty much the perfect lenses and the perfect size to use on an MFT body like a GH6 or a Z-Cam. It's not super small like the photo versions of these lenses were back in the day, like the 25mm photo version was tiny. And not that this matters, but the layout, construction, and lettering and colors and all that stuff look pretty cool and professional to me. I like the look aesthetically of the lenses, if that makes any sense. Not that it doesn't matter. These lenses have no in-body image stabilization, but I do have a bunch of presets saved in my GH6, which makes it relatively easy to swap the lenses and enable the image stabilization. Before I go into the nitty-gritty, which I will do, don't worry, I just wanted to talk about the impressionistic, artistic, dreamy qualities of these lenses, as many will call it, or otherwise known as the flaws. Yes, the lenses are a bit soft wide open for sure, and have even softer corners, but most of the time that really helps just draw me into my subject, helps me focus on them with such a blurry background, and combined with the huge amounts of background blur these lenses can achieve, they're very helpful lenses from a creative standpoint when trying to tell a story. It can really help curb down the sharpness of digital sensors like the 5.7 8K that the GH6 has with no OLPF. And sometimes I want stuff to be soulful and resonate on an emotional level and not really look like a corporate commercial shoot. And other times I might want to stop down a little bit and get a sharper, cleaner effect. But I do like how soft and organic these lenses are in combination with the GH6 sensor specifically. These lenses are built to be kind to human subjects, to people, to narrative, and to focus on them and throw away anything in the background that could be distracting. To swirl and blur parts of the image away and just really build a painterly beautiful image. And love it or hate it, by the end of this review you will definitely hopefully get a pretty good idea of the look these lenses can provide. If you like painterly bokeh, soft corners, rainbow lens flares, and quirks, these lenses might be perfect for you and the story you're trying to tell. That being said, I think knowing the technical performance of your gear is important. They'll never be quite as perfect as an electrically corrected first-party lens from Leica, but the entire set costs less than the 10-25 alone and has a lot wider of an aperture. And when you stop the lenses down, that gap really does narrow pretty quickly. Anyway, the actual performance, let's look at the 17mm. I went for the brick wall approach for the 17mm since the test chart was just a little bit too close to the minimum focus distance. Anyway, yeah, there's a bit of ghosting here, but just like most of these lenses we'll look at, the center is actually pretty okay, but I'd say the softest of the set, in my opinion. And when you go to the corners, yeah, it's wild. Although, to be fair, when you're shooting 16:9 video, it's going to be a lot less visible. But if you're shooting open gate or photos, yeah, it's pretty noticeable. 1.4 is a lot punchier in the middle, but those corners are about the same. 2, you see a little bit more sharpness across the board. 2.8, 4, 5.6, even down to like F8 and F11, those corners are just a little bit shakier in the extremes than you would think. 25mm is much better right away in the center. Those tiny elements are known for having a decent amount of field curvature, and so the corners are very blurry compared to the center since they're literally on a different focal plane. Although keep in mind, if you focus into the corner, the center will be out of focus, but you can get a sharp corner image if you want to play with framing and stuff like that. Going from T1 to T1.4, you're already seeing a good improvement in vignetting, contrast, sharpness in the center, but it really does take 2.8, I would say between 2.8 and 4 to get sharp image quality across the frame. This field curvature really has a nice sweet spot of sharpness and provides a kind of creative look for me. So, you know, the field curvature, not great for shooting test charts, but not bad for shooting interviews. There you go. Moving on to the 35mm. Again, I'm pretty impressed at the center of the frame at wide open, only being a little bit ghosty wide open, but just like the 25mm, those corners are blurry. 1.4 improves the already good center, but the corners only see some brightness. It takes going down to 2.8, 4, 5.6 to get any appreciable detail out of those corners well focused on the center of the frame. The 50mm is a little strange. It's a little softer than the previous two lenses. It's the best across the frame, but the worst in the center so far. Anyway, 1.4 to 2.8, all that stuff, you see the lens shake off some of that ghosting and softness, and it generally looks pretty good. It also should be noted that these lenses do have a pretty minor but noticeable magenta cast to them shooting wide open, so either embrace it or be sure to adjust that in post or while shooting with a custom white balance. Personally, I do kind of like a warmer magenta-y image, but it's not everybody's cup of tea, and when you stop down, it gets a lot better. The 17 and 25 both have a bit of distortion. I tend not to mind it too much, but if you're shooting like a extreme close-up of somebody, especially at those close focus distances, it can accentuate that distortion. The 17mm doesn't really breathe that much when rack focusing, but the 25, 35, and 50, they're all about the same, just about average for a budget cinema lens. Definitely worse than you would expect for a cinema lens, but when you see the price, it makes a lot more sense. Let's kind of change our angle here, get out of the sun. Hope that sun wasn't too bad. Something I always value about lenses is their close focusing ability, since I hate being limited creatively or when trying to get a certain shot or having to pause and use diopters or something along those lines. Thankfully, these lenses generally have a pretty respectable close focus ability. The 17 is by far the worst here, having a fairly average close focusing distance and a pretty hazy image quality when you do get a close-up. The 25mm and 35mm are very similar when it comes to reproduction size, and the image even holds up pretty good, even at wide open at the minimum focus. The 50mm can't get quite as close of an image or large of an image reproduction, but the image quality holds up pretty good for 4K video or some photo work. Chromatic aberration, and specifically longitudinal chromatic aberration, is always a tough point for these cheap ultra-wide lenses, or even some more expensive ones like the Leica 42.5, and honestly, these are no exception. The 17mm isn't as bad as I thought. It's just, I don't know, maybe the ghosting covers it up, but not great either. The 25mm has a pretty apparent red and blue kind of shift before and after the focal plane, and this will definitely show up in your images from time to time, especially if your images are mostly just bright, shiny coins in direct sunlight. The 35mm, not much different than the 25, but the colors are swapped, more like a blue-green color. And the 50mm, again, isn't worse per se, but personally, I find that like nuclear blue fringing is worse in most situations than that more subtle green or red or magenta that other lenses were producing. If this effect is really bothering you, I would definitely try stopping down 1.4, 2, and that'll clean up quite a bit. The flare is wild with these lenses and is some of my favorite parts of these lenses, but you know, like I said, it's wild, so you gotta know what you're doing. I really like the rainbow ring on the 17mm, but I have to admit the loss of contrast and that broad flaring when the light is on the edge of the frame is a little bit more intrusive on your image than the other lenses, at least in my experience. The 25mm has a beautiful flare, and I really love how the light interacts with the optics on this lens. I always had, even from the photo days. And the 35mm isn't much different, although the bigger APS-C lens elements leave you with a pretty big green blob in the middle of the frame. A little bit more noticeable than any other lenses, but in real world use, I don't notice it that much. The 50mm probably is second place for flares for me. It's got those big red rings and the rainbow circles and all that fun stuff. Generally, those flares are super fun, super creative. If you like J.J. Abrams lens flares, using them creatively and having these rainbow colors and extra effects for music videos and narrative stuff, this definitely is really, really fun to mess around with. It's definitely easy to overdo though, so watch out. I don't really have much to say on the Sunstars. They're pretty meh. You know, some people find the really big starburst lens flares kind of distracting. So if that's the case for you, these are pretty subtle. But it is cool to have those like multi-pointed starburst occasionally, like the Voigtlanders might produce. I wouldn't mind either way, but that's how it is on these lenses. All of those examples were taken wide open, but when you stop this down to 2, 4, something like that, the flares, just like the bokeh and the image quality, become a lot less quirky and a little bit more standard. So if the lack of contrast and these giant rainbow flares are a little too distracting, just stop down the lens a little bit. Okay, since you guys have been very good and watching this whole video and definitely not skipping around to look at different chapters, now it's time to look at the bokeh. Yes, this is where the lens set tends to shine or might die for some people. I mean, at least for me, I really love the bokeh, but I can definitely see people not loving it as much. So let's go lens by lens. The 17 definitely has conflicting bokeh, sometimes smooth, sometimes a little grittier. And of course, our friend green fringing is back from the chromatic aberration tests. The 25mm, on the other hand, has really quirky bokeh at medium or even pretty close distances. It can look a little busy and smudgy. We've got some fairly distinct rings around the specular highlights, as well as that green familiar chromatic aberration. The bokeh smears also towards the edge of the frame more than usual, and the whole image just has like a painterly, smudgy, buttery feel to it, but with a little bit more edge than you would expect sometimes. 35mm, very similar, although it has much more capacity to blur the background. So overall, I would say the bokeh definitely feels smoother generally from this lens and has a little bit less of the harsh outlining and green fringing compared to the 25mm. Although I don't know what this says about me, but I do tend to use that 25mm a little bit more. And the 50mm, it can obviously completely throw out even the most complex backgrounds deeply and completely. And it's got a 100mm f1.8. The bokeh pretty much always looks nice and pretty smooth, although distant shots and stuff that's just somewhat out of background can be a little busy like the rest of the lenses, but I don't know. I generally think it looks kind of cool. Overall, love it or hate it with this type of bokeh. It's quirky, it has cat's eye or other weird shapes in the corner or fringing around the specular highlights, and often does look pretty busy and edgy, but that vintage character with some of those modern designs, it's something that I really look out for, and I know a lot of people really seek in modern optics, which are a little bit more consistent than vintage optics. Yeah, it creates a noticeable pattern and a noticeable look, but just like the flares, stopping this down to 1.4, 2 or 2.8 for a more middle ground image or even a pretty clean corporate look is very possible, making these lenses pretty versatile in my opinion. Before getting into some of my final thoughts, I guess, on the good and bad or whatever, I just wanted to give some advice on purchasing these lenses. So I guess I would recommend buying them from ZYoptics' own website, since 1, they have sales on their own lenses more than you'd think, and 2, the lenses have a 3-year warranty instead of a single year from a place like B&H. My first 17mm had an issue with their focus ring, and they replaced it fairly quickly by the time I ended up sending it in. So just make sure you keep that payment information and order numbers and all that stuff around from your purchase. So I also recommend, I think, not just starting with 1 lens, but going for the 3 or 4 lens kit, as they are discounted quite a decent bit compared to the individual prices, and come with a pretty nice carrying case for the lenses, which couldn't hurt, right? Okay, so let's talk about some of the issues and downsides and things you might wanna think about before getting these lenses. So the build quality is good, but a little inconsistent. Like we talked about, some stuff lines up, some stuff doesn't. There's a few inconsistencies. I'm not sure the focus markings always quite line up with what it says on the lens barrel, but how much does anybody use that kind of depends on you. I'd also say it doesn't 100% match the image quality and character across the range like a real cinema lens would or a set would, but again, it's extremely close, so I've never noticed any color or any inconsistencies that would be notable in my opinion. The 17mm I also just don't quite love. It's just got not that great of a minimum focus, not that great of image quality. It's not that wide. It just is like a little bit like, I don't know. It's just not my favorite lens of the set. I wish it was a little better in one or two ways for sure. And you know, speaking of, I also think it's a downside that there's not a wider lens. The 17mm is not really a true wide angle, and that can definitely be a little bit limiting in some situations for sure. I've been using the Voigtlander 10.5mm, which is the only lens that wide that has even vaguely similar specs, I think. Maybe some stuff from SLR Magic as well does, but that's been my solution, is using the Voigtlander 10.5 for a 21mm equivalent wide angle. There is a part of me that thinks the Voigtlander lens set might be better for someone who's a hybrid shooter. I felt like I could do photography with the Voigtlanders on the street, but these really feel and look dedicated for video, and taking photos with them feels just kind of silly. I mean, that might just be me, but that's been my experience. So some of the biggest upsides, but this is also a downside of course too, but the image. I really love the image coming out of this. I love the results. I love the flares. I love the bokeh. These lenses are for me, as someone who loved like the old Helios, but could never quite get the same mileage out of it on Micro Four Thirds as I wanted to. It's also, they're good, they're small, but not too small to be usable in, you know, film set situations. They've got good build quality and characteristics and features to use on a big set and as a solo operator. They have great abilities and features that makes them easy to just pick up and use, and also easy to rig out. And of course, they're versatile, like we talked about a few times. Stopping the lenses down to f2, I think, for the best middle ground, maybe 1.4 if you want a little bit more quirky edge. But 2.8, those lenses really become a good general prime set. And I think you could use them in a lot of different scenarios like that for sure. And of course, at a competitive price of like $400 a piece, I know the Nightwalkers are like $350 a piece. But they're a little slower, but maybe a little bit better build quality or image quality. I think they're pretty comparable, honestly. You know, you got to decide. I think these lenses are more versatile than those lenses from what I've seen. The price of like $1350-ish for a 4-lens kit with a case with 3-year warranty is really solid. And if you're looking to do more creative work, more really low light work, and really want to get the most out of these smaller sensors and what these cameras can do, these cinema lenses are really, really solid, and I plan on using them for quite a while. So yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. That's my review. I've been using these lenses for a long time, and going from a wedding to a feature film to a series of music videos, the look that they've provided has really impressed me, impressed the people I've been working with and for to create these projects. And I really enjoy Mitakon as a company, ZYoptics, all the different names they have. These lenses really put, you know, they're not lying when they're called Speedmasters. They let in a ton of light, and they are really fantastic. Let me know what you think of these lenses, if you've used them, if you've been curious about them, and if you've used any other lenses for maybe the L mount or other lenses that ZYoptics has produced over the years. And yeah, thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. I'll see you guys in the next one.